In my last video, I talked about what red teams really do in a professional context, but what exactly goes into running a red team? It's far more than just getting some friends together and saying, go forth and hack. If your team isn't designed properly from the ground up, you're not going to be able to perform efficiently, and your ability to capture more work will be severely limited. So let's explore all of the necessary components that make up a red team to get you on track. In this video, I want to talk about some of the essential components that make up an effective and well-rounded red team. I've seen plenty of people who think that starting a red team is just getting a bunch of tech-savvy nerds in a room together and saying, okay, we're ready to hack. But it's much more complicated than that. In fact, that was how my first red team was started, and it can work for a time, but it isn't sustainable. If your team doesn't have the appropriate roles, responsibilities, processes, and other components in place, its ability to operate is going to be severely limited, and your operations will be rudimentary at best. So what are the elements that make up an effective red team? All of the components I'm going to talk about fall into four major categories, so let's start with those. First is personnel. Obviously, you need people to do the job. On a red team, there are a lot of roles that have to be filled by your staff. There are people who are on keyboard, there's support staff, there's management, of course, there's developers writing code, so all kinds of different skill sets you need, which may have some overlap in the same person, but you will need people of different skill sets and specialties to make the team really run well. Second is operational capabilities. These are things that your team are going to need to actually conduct the engagements that they're tasked with. This could be anything from the TTPs they're going to use against targets to their own custom tooling. A lot of what your team uses, especially when you're first starting out, is going to be open source tools. So don't worry about anything fancy in this category just yet if you're still a young red team. Third is supporting processes and capabilities. This is a big category that has to do with the management and execution of a red team capability, not the engagement itself. These are things like the reporting structure on the team, data sharing, both amongst the team and with external stakeholders, keeping your staff continuously trained up, having threat intelligence to inform your future engagements, and lots of other things that we'll get into soon. Fourth is standards. Your team needs to do things in a standardized way, which will help you execute efficiently and help you report effectively so that you can deliver maximum value to your customers. All right, so let's go into some more detail in these categories. First up is your personnel. Now, depending on the maturity or age of your red team, you may or may not need all of these roles, and some people will fill more than one role, and that's okay. You'll have to find what works for you. When you're especially small and just starting out, you'll more than likely have a lot of overlap amongst your personnel who are doing multiple things, and that's just fine. When you start to max out their capacity to fill those roles, that's when you know it's time to grow. Anyway, what falls into this category? First, we have our on-keyboard personnel, or at least that's what I'm calling them. Your organization might call them hackers, ethical hackers, even pen testers or operators, something like that. But these are the people who are actually on keyboard doing the engagement. They're the ones actually using the tools to have some effect against the objective. Second up in this category, I'm calling operational support staff. There's a lot of different things that can fall into this category, but they're generally just a role that supports the on-keyboard personnel while they're conducting their engagement. This could mean they're looking at data that's being brought back to try and analyze the network. They could be training and running some, for lack of a better word, some grunt work for the on-keyboard personnel while they're doing something a little more intense. This is kind of a support role that's a jack of all trades. Now, I've been a part of teams that do have these support staff and teams that don't, and it's really not necessary until the red team gets very big and mature. Eventually, you'll have enough work that you'll need help balancing all the tasks to do on an engagement. That's when you'll need to really look into this category of personnel. Third, developers. This is one that you're likely to overlap a lot with your on-keyboard personnel because everyone knows how to write a script or do some basic programming if they're in this field. Your developers are the ones creating tooling. This can be on-target tooling, as well as some back-end tooling for systems that are internal to your team. These developers really won't be tasked with creating a lot of custom tooling early on in your red team's lifecycle, but that's something that a more mature team is going to need eventually. If you're emulating TTPs of a known actor, which as you will be doing quite a bit, then the developers won't be as concerned with on-target tooling and more of data flow and back-end tasks. Fourth up, everybody's favorite, managers. Love to hate them, but we need them. Someone to manage the team, manage the stakeholders, do the nasty paperwork that can actually allow us to do our jobs effectively. As much as we computer guys don't love management, this is absolutely vital to an effective red team. If it's just a bunch of hackers, they're not going to be able to capture more work, interface with customers, and grow the team. Good management is absolutely vital to the future and development of the team. And if you're watching this video, chances are you're at least interested in or already wearing a managerial hat, since this is about how red teams work. All right, so moving on from personnel into operational capabilities. These are the capabilities that actually assist your team during an engagement. This will include their tooling, which will often be based on the actor you're emulating, or it can be custom, or just off-the-shelf stuff if they're just emulating a generic threat or a generic attack against a target. Also in this category, I'm putting the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. These aren't tools themselves, but they define how the tools are used. The TTPs govern how a threat uses the tools against vulnerabilities in your network defenses to have some effect on the objective. So these TTPs govern how you will eventually achieve your goals on an engagement. Now, I'm not going to list it here, but implicit in these two items is the need for ongoing training. Your on-keyboard personnel are only as good as they are familiar with the tools and the TTPs they're going to be required to use for an engagement. So we're assuming you have some way of allowing your team to experience or gain ongoing training, whether on company time or with external training, something like that. And you can probably already start to see some relationships here between personnel and the operational capabilities. The developers who will be working on tools, the on-keyboard personnel who will be utilizing the TTPs, these all have relationships and match up in some way. And you'll see that more as your team grows. With that, let's move into the third and largest category, supporting processes and capabilities. Starting with the reporting structure. Reporting structure is important both within your team and external to your team. There are going to be leaders on the team, either senior personnel who've been doing this for a while, or just reporting to management on the team. There's also going to be the reporting structure external to your red team, whether you're reporting to a CISO or some security director. All of that reporting structure, both internal and external, needs to be well defined so that it's understood who has authority to make certain decisions and who needs to be informed of occurrences on engagements. If you go into an engagement without understanding your reporting structure, you will experience chaos and not knowing what to do next when something happens. Next is data sharing, both within and external to your team. This is about who needs to know what. Who do you need to report to when certain things happen? Who has authority to make certain decisions? This is very important to have in place prior to any engagements so that chaos doesn't break out when something goes awry or something unexpected occurs. Very closely related to data sharing is data handling security. You need to know how to transfer this data from one party to the next in a secure format. And your requirements for that will differ between every organization you work for, every customer you work for. Some customers may require encryption at rest and transfer, all that stuff. Some customers might not care as much as long as it's in a secure portal or something like that. But this is something you'll define ahead of time before your engagement starts. Next, as is implied in the previous category, continuous training. Your staff needs ongoing practical and professional training to keep up on the developments of the security world and the latest techniques and tools that are out there in the wild. The world of cybersecurity moves incredibly quickly, and if your team doesn't have a way of keeping up to date on what's going on, they're going to fall behind, and their ability to emulate the latest, most sophisticated threats will quickly diminish. A very closely related and important component to continuous training is threat intelligence. Part of your team's training is knowing how to emulate certain threats and what the best actors out there in the world are doing. That's where threat intelligence comes in. It tells you what those actors are up to and how they're doing it. This can be publicly delivered APT reports. This can be private intel feeds that some companies offer. Anything that gets you intel on the latest developments out there in the wild. Next, probably everybody's least favorite thing, stakeholder management. As a red team, you have certain stakeholders who are paying your bills, aka customers, I'll call them that. You have entities that are in authority over you, they're stakeholders. A stakeholder is basically anybody who is affected by, responsible for, or providing input to your team during or after an engagement. There's a lot of stakeholders that could be at play depending on the complexity of your engagement, and identifying them and managing them well is absolutely critical to the future of your team. The last thing I've put in this category is infrastructure, and there are two types here. Attack infrastructure and team infrastructure. And that's what I'm calling it, at least. Attack infrastructure is probably self-explanatory. That's how your on-keyboard personnel are actually doing their job against the target. This can mean virtual machines, cloud networks, whatever it takes to get their keystrokes to a target. Team infrastructure is anything on the back end. This is both how data flows back from an engagement to your team in whatever repositories or networks you have. It's how data is managed internally, how knowledge is managed, all those things that happen behind the scenes. There's actually a lot of possibilities here for more efficient red teaming that teams tend to miss until they grow very mature. So in a future video, I'm going to go into great detail on what you can do here. The last category of component I'm going to go into, I'm calling standards. These are things that make your life running a red team a lot easier, starting with note-taking. All of your personnel on keyboard are going to have to take detailed notes about what they do. This will be important for diagnosing things that go wrong, as well as accurately reporting what they were able to achieve on an engagement. Creating those reports after the fact is far, far easier if you have a standardized way of taking notes, instead of every person you have taking notes in a completely different way that are very hard to suss out and figure out what happened when and where. Related to that is the format of the report itself. This is probably going to be dependent on your customer or some other stakeholders, but what does that final report actually look like? You can't normally just print out the raw notes from your on-keyboard people and say, here's my report. There's probably an executive summary and some technical details that need to go into this report, and you'll want to agree with your stakeholders on this ahead of time so that they know what to expect. Thirdly, and this might be a little bit of a stretch for the standards category, but I'm putting here standardized training. As your red team grows and you recruit more personnel, you need to establish a common baseline of skills and knowledge that the entire team should have, no matter what they really want to specialize in the future. You'll need some form of training ground to get everybody up to speed to at least a basic operating level so that they can be an individual contributor to the team. If everyone's left to their own devices, just kind of become good at hacking, then there's no telling what that might mean for each individual person, and you could end up with very serious gaps in the skill sets of certain staff. All right, so with those 4 categories established, we've got an awful lot to talk about here, and we're going to have to make videos for at least each of those categories, if not the subcomponents, because as my experience has shown me, there's an awful lot to unpack, and there's tons of possibilities here, but also risks that need to be taken into consideration. So hopefully that whets your appetite to learn more in the future. Please let me know what you think of the video, and give me any ideas that you have, things you'd like to know about red teaming. Drop a comment if you have any feedback, and if not, I'll see you in the next video.